You know that feeling. You're stuck in LA traffic, absolutely jammed, and then someone just glides past on a bike. Or maybe you remember how easy it was getting around New York on the subway. Well, a Reddit user had exactly that kind of jolt recently, came back from NYC, and suddenly saw their everyday, car-dependent LA life totally differently.
Yeah, it really throws it into sharp relief.
And it makes you wonder, how do we even start to make a city like Los Angeles truly walkable? I mean, it feels almost impossible with all this concrete, how spread out everything is.
It's a frustration a lot of people feel, definitely, especially in these sprawling cities.
Yeah.
That longing just to get around easily on foot.
Right.
And it's not a new thing either. Way back in the 1960s, Jane Jacobs was already talking about how important walkable neighborhoods are.
Okay.
Now we hear terms like the 15-minute city. You know, the idea that everything you really need day to day should be a short walk or maybe a bike right away.
Exactly. So that's really the mission for this deep dive, to try and get under the skin of this challenge. We'll focus on LA, using the sources you brought together.
Sounds good.
We've got quite a mix. There's a Cornell Law School article that gives a big picture overview, legally and planning-wise. Then that Reddit discussion, which has those really crucial sort of on-the-ground views from Angelinos.
Yeah, the personal experiences.
Plus a press release about funding for pedestrian safety, specifically in West Rancho Dominguez. Information on Measure HLA, which is pretty ambitious.
Very ambitious.
And finally, an academic paper that really drills down into walkability, specifically in downtown LA.
Right, a focused look.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Where did this whole problem come from? Because it goes way back, apparently.
Absolutely. It's not like these challenges just appeared overnight. They're often a direct result of decisions made, well, over a century ago.
A century? Wow.
Yeah, the Cornell Law article points way back to the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act. That was in the 1920s. And this act basically gave local governments the green light to control land use. It really set the stage for separating things out. You know, houses here, shops over there, industry somewhere else entirely.
So separating everything.
Right. And while maybe the idea was to create some kind of order, a huge unintended consequence was, well, sprawl, the kind of cities we see now. This act provided the legal basis for what's called Euclidean zoning.
Euclidean zoning. And we know sprawl when we see it, right? Low-density housing that just goes on forever.
Miles and miles.
Shops and workplaces super far apart, those weird disconnected roads people call stroads.
Yeah, not quite streets, not quite roads.
And hardly any space designed just for people walking. And the cost. The article mentions over $1 trillion a year in the U.S. Why so much?
Well, think about it. When everything spread thin, the cost per person for basic infrastructure roads, power lines, water, sewer, even things like school buses, it just skyrockets.
Right, more pipes, more wires.
Exactly. Compare that to a compact neighborhood. But it's not just the money. There are big social equity issues, too.
How so?
Car dependency basically isolates people who can't afford a car, or maybe can't drive, or choose not to.
Okay.
And this hits low-income communities, minority groups, older adults harder. It limits their access to jobs, to healthcare, even just social connection.
It's really the complete opposite of what Jane Jacobs was advocating for, wasn't it?
Absolutely. She talked about the vitality, the energy you get from mixed-use areas, that live work-play idea.
Yeah.
And the Cornell article actually lists some pretty compelling benefits of those kinds of places.
Like what?
Like significantly less, driving maybe 20 to 40% less. Lower infrastructure costs, about 10% less on average for services.
Okay, that makes sense.
And this one's surprising. Potentially up to 10 times more tax revenue per acre compared to typical suburban development.
10 times? How does that work? What causes that big jump?
It's mostly about density and variety. You've got homes, shops, maybe light industry, all packed into a smaller space, all paying taxes on land that might otherwise just have a few houses.
Gotcha. More economic activity per square foot.
Precisely. And what's also really interesting is how these mixed-use places seem to build stronger communities. When people are out walking, bumping into each other, you get more social connection. It can combat that isolation you sometimes find in car-centric suburbs.
Right.
Plus, you know, people walking more is good for health. And like Jacobs famously said, more eyes on the street can actually make places feel safer.
Okay, so here's the big question, the head-scratcher. If these walkable neighborhoods are so great, why don't we have more of them?
Yeah.
The Cornell article says our zoning rules often make them basically illegal. Like up to 75% of land in many U.S. cities is zoned only for single-family houses.
It's staggering, isn't it?
So it's not just taste, it's baked into the law. Stemming from that Euclidean zoning, which comes from that 1926 Supreme Court case, Village of Euclid v. Ambler Realty Co. What was the upshot of that case?
That case basically said, yes, zoning is constitutional. Municipalities have the right to regulate land use to protect public health, safety, welfare. And, crucially, that included separating different land uses.
Okay.
Now, it was probably well-intentioned back then, but that legal precedent has really shaped how our cities grew, often prioritizing separation over mixed-use, walkable places.
And changing that now is tough.
Very tough. That legal framework is incredibly hard to shift, partly because of NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Residents worry that more density or mixing uses will change their neighborhood's character or, and this is often the big one, lower their property values.
Understandable fears individually, but
collectively, they create massive roadblocks to zoning reform.
And we can't forget the federal government's role in all this, right? All that money poured into highways for decades.
Huge amounts. Federal spending has heavily favored highway construction over almost everything else.
And that leads to induced demand.
Exactly. Yeah. Build more roads, and perhaps counterintuitively, you often just encourage more driving, which can make traffic worse in the long run. It's a cycle that feeds itself and actively discourages walkable alternatives.
Okay, so that's the big picture, the history. Now let's zoom in on LA, the specific issues there.
Right, and this is where that Reddit discussion becomes so valuable. It just grounds all these abstract ideas.
Yeah.
You really feel that users' frustration coming back from walkable New York to the reality of LA sprawl.
That feeling that it's just too big, too much concrete, maybe impossible to fix in our lifetime.
That comes through loud and clear. It's a common feeling for Angelinos who've seen other ways cities can work. And yeah, NIMBYism definitely pops up in the discussion as a real, tangible barrier.
There was an interesting point in that thread about whether middle-class folks in LA even want denser housing near transit.
Right.
The argument being maybe they prefer a single-family house, a yard, good schools, even if they have to use park and ride for the train. But someone else pushed back saying, well, is that a real preference, or is it because the good schools happen to be in those car-dependent areas, it limits your choices? Kind of a chicken and egg thing.
It absolutely is a chicken and egg situation. People make choices based on the options available, which don't always reflect what they'd ideally want.
Yeah.
And the Reddit thread also mentions worries about crime and safety on public transit. BART was brought up.
Right.
Whether those perceptions are entirely accurate or maybe overblown, they definitely can put people off using transit. And if you're not using transit, why live right next to it?
Which leads us to transit-oriented development, TOD. The picture painted in the Reddit thread for LA sounds, well, a bit discouraging.
It does.
Issues like high construction costs, sometimes rents aren't actually that high in these new TOD buildings, and real questions about whether they're even boosting transit ridership much.
Yeah, and mentions of projects actually stalling suggest the economics aren't always working out. What are the big hurdles for TOD in LA?
Several things, it seems. Land is expensive. The permitting process can be a nightmare.
Long and complicated.
You need major infrastructure upgrades. All that makes it financially tough. Plus, if the neighborhood around the TOD isn't walkable, if there aren't shops or cafes,
then residents might still end up driving everywhere anyway, kind of defeating the purpose.
Exactly. And like the thread said, sometimes the rents just aren't high enough to make the project pencil out without big subsidies.
And another fascinating point from Reddit, people moving out to the exurbs may be helped by remote work.
Right. Does that weaken the case for dense city living?
It certainly raises questions about how strong that demand will be long-term.
Now, California has passed laws trying to override local zoning controls, push for more density near transit.
Yeah, trying to tackle the housing crisis.
But the Reddit discussion suggests these laws haven't been a magic bullet for walkability in LA. Developer finances, the type of housing being built, still major issues. The graffiti towers get mentioned as kind of a symbol of this lots of density, but not necessarily affordable or making the surrounding area more walkable.
And that example from Sunnyvale, Santa Clara is telling too. High-density housing near Caltrain, but it's unsold because
there's nothing else around, no shops, no restaurants within walking distance.
Right. It shows that just building units near transit isn't enough. People need the stuff of daily life nearby to ditch the car.
The thread even brings up California's builder's remedy and how, maybe paradoxically, it could even increase sprawl sometimes. How would that work?
Well, as I understand it, if a city's housing plan isn't compliant, Builder's remedy lets developers bypass local zoning.
Okay.
But that could mean dense projects get built in places without the right infrastructure or amenities, potentially making people more car-dependent, not less.
Huh. Unintended consequences.
It seems like it.
Another key thing from Reddit. LA's islands of density. We have these walkable pockets, right? Culver City, the arts district.
At Water Village, yeah.
But they're often surrounded by miles of car-centric suburbs, makes efficient public transit really hard.
Totally different from older East Coast cities with those big, continuous walkable cores.
And even in some denser LA spots, the walking experience itself can be bad. Reddit users mention narrow sidewalks, cracked pavement, no shade trees, traffic whizzing by.
Which really underscores why the design of the street itself matters so much.
Yeah.
And that's where things like Complete Streets initiatives, and especially the recently passed Measure HLA, come in. They're trying to fix those problems, make walking and biking safer, nicer.
Measure HLA. We'll get more into that. The idea of e-bikes also came up on Reddit as a way to handle LA's distances.
An interesting adaptation, right?
Yeah.
Acknowledging the sprawl, but finding tech to bridge the gaps.
It's a good reminder, too, that even if LA overall is car-centric, lots of individual neighborhoods are walkable. The big challenge is often getting between them.
Absolutely. And the academic paper on downtown LA adds some really vital history to understand how we got here.
It really does. It shows that early LA wasn't always this way. It actually had a walkable downtown.
And a great rail system, apparently. World class, even.
But then the car arrived, and some key decisions or maybe failures to act changed everything. The paper mentions a protest in the 1920s against a parking ban.
Right. And a proposal for an elevated railway that just failed.
Yeah.
Pivotal moments that shifted priorities towards the car.
Yeah.
And those early choices really set the stage for LA fully embracing the car-dominated landscape after World War II.
Yeah.
Helped along by all that federal highway money and the rush to the suburbs.
The paper even mentions a planning director, Calvin Hamilton, who suggested getting pedestrians off the streets entirely, build pedways above ground.
Crazy, right. But it really shows the peak car-centric thinking back then.
And the paper contrasts that sort of boosterism view of LA car culture with a much harsher take calling it a fortress city with a ruined public realm.
A powerful critique. It reminds us the city we see today wasn't inevitable. It's the result of specific choices over many decades.
Okay, so given all that history, all those ingrained challenges, what are the potential solutions? What could the future of walkability actually look like in LA or similar cities?
Well, there are hopeful signs, like that $7.99 million grant for West Rancho Dominguez.
Right, the safety funding.
Exactly. It's specifically targeting dangerous intersections, guided by their Vision Zero action plan to eliminate traffic deaths.
And it seems needed there. The press release said 1 in 15 residents rely on walking, biking, or transit.
Yeah, shows a clear local need for safer streets for people not in cars.
That local focus feels key.
Yeah.
And then, bigger picture, there's Measure HLA. It passed even with some opposition.
It did pass, yeah, which is potentially huge. It basically mandates that the city has to implement its own mobility plan when they repave streets.
So things like bike lanes, wider sidewalks, bus lanes.
Exactly. They have to incorporate those elements.
The voter support suggests people want this.
Definitely seems that way. But the opposition from the firefighters union worried about emergency access, others concerned about cost, lawsuits. It highlights that these changes aren't simple.
Yeah.
There are real complexities and trade-offs.
Sure.
But the goal, zero traffic fatalities, expanding bike and bus networks, it's ambitious.
This leads us nicely to Jeff Speck's ideas in the academic paper, his general theory of walkability.
Right. Useful, safe, comfortable, and interesting, those 4 qualities.
And his 10 steps of walkability, it seems like a really practical framework, more about the experience of walking than just a number like the walk score.
Exactly. The paper notes walk score has limits. Speck's approach is more qualitative.
Yeah.
Let's touch on a few of his steps that seem really relevant for LA.
Okay.
First, putting cars in their place.
Yeah.
He talks about induced demand, like we mentioned,
Right.
and says you need strong political will and, frankly, a re-education of traffic engineers to prioritize complete streets over just moving cars fast.
Okay.
He also suggests trying things like pedestrian-only zones, maybe congestion pricing.
Bold ideas, then mixing the uses. We talked about this echoing Jane Jacobs.
Yes. The paper stresses getting more housing downtown, acknowledging it's tough politically, permits are hard, funding is tricky, but also creating that mix of things people need and enjoy. Parks, markets, cafes, schools, that's what brings life and attracts residents.
Makes sense. What's next?
Getting the parking right. This is a big one. Speck argues we have way too much parking, and it actively hinders walkability and redevelopment.
How so?
Takes up valuable land, makes projects more expensive. He suggests things like parking cash-out programs, getting rid of parking minimums, those Donald Shoup ideas,
Okay.
pricing on street parking properly, maybe parking benefit districts where the meter money goes back into the neighborhood. Rethinking parking seems key.
Absolutely. And he connects walkability tightly with transit, right? Letting transit work.
Vitally connected.
Oh.
He points out the funding bias towards roads and says voters should get to decide on transit funding.
Makes sense.
And crucially, you need density and walkable areas around the transit stops for it to work well. Plus his criteria for good transit: urbanity, clarity, frequency, and pleasure.
Pleasure. Interesting.
Yeah, making the experience itself pleasant, not just functional.
Okay. And finally,
Protecting the pedestrian. Super important. Using road diets, slimming down car lanes to slow traffic and make room for people walking or biking.
okay.
He also mentions fixing things like super long left turn lanes that make crossings scary, suggesting they be shortened.
Simple fixes, potentially big impact.
It seems like the overarching message is clear. We have to rethink our streets, put people first. It's crucial for health, business, community, the environment, especially in a place like LA with such a car-heavy history.
It really does feel like it boils down to shifting how we prioritize using our shared public space.
That's a great way to put it.
Right.
Precisely.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it's clear that making sprawling cities like LA more walkable is, well, it's a massive undertaking. You've got the whole legacy of zoning, infrastructure, even culture built around the car.
Deep roots.
Plus, real resistance to change and undeniable economic factors to figure out.
Definitely not easy.
Yeah.
But as we saw with the West Rancho Dominguez grant and Measure HLA passing, there is a growing understanding that we need a different path. There's real momentum building.
The desire seems to be there.
Yeah, for more livable, sustainable cities, it's gaining ground.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, our listener. Considering this really deep history of car culture and the concrete reality of many cities, what do you think is the single most impactful change needed? Could it be policy, infrastructure, maybe just a shift in mindset? What's the one thing that could truly start moving the needle towards walkable, sustainable cities? Might be interesting to see what urban planning discussions are happening in your own community.